Grace Becker searched the star-flecked horizon for something to focus on, anything to stop her from looking down as she inched her way along the ledge. Pressing her back as close to the brickwork as she could, she used her fingers to feel her way along the outer wall of the bridge. Somewhere in the darkness, 10, maybe even 20 metres beneath her, was a railway track. If she slipped, a few broken bones would be the least of her worries. She paused, rested her head against the wall and closed her eyes. The cool bricks provided a momentary distraction from the heat that was quickly building beneath her balaclava. Grace curled her toes, checking the ledge beneath her feet. She didn't dare move them any further forwards. The tips of her trainers were just a few millimetres from the edge. If she curled her toes to find nothing firm beneath, she knew she would be unable to move. Nearly there, just a few more steps. Grace opened her eyes and immediately realised it had been a mistake to stop. The horizon started to tilt and her head began to spin, her skin prickling with sweat. "Don't get too comfy there, Princess," said a voice on the ledge beside her. "The middle of the bridge is the highest point from the ground. Have a quick look down and check, will you?" Instinctively, Grace bowed her head just as a train exploded into existence beneath her. She flung her head back, gasping as it cracked on the wall behind her. The train thundered below, a seemingly endless stream of carriages clanking over the tracks she had been trying so hard not to think about. After what felt like a lifetime, the final carriage emerged from under the bridge and carried away the noise that had filled the night air. Next to her, the silence was broken by the unmistakable sound of stifled laughter. "You think that's funny, Trick?" Grace asked between gulps of air. "Would it have been funny if I'd fallen?" "Well, perhaps not funny in the conventional sense." He shuffled towards her, almost close enough for their arms to touch. "I hate you. You know that." "Come on," he said, laughing softly. "You're nearly there." The single street lamp on the bridge above was shrouded in darkness, the bulb inside having been broken earlier by a well-aimed rock. Staying out of sight was one of their most important rules, although, with the darkness beneath her almost palpable, Grace had begun to wonder if safety should feature a little higher on their list. Trick's silhouette moved on the ledge beside her, and even in the shadows she was able to make out the sharp outline of his jaw, the smooth curve of his bicep beneath his shirt. Moments later, his fingers curled around Grace's arm, and instantly she felt safer. "Okay," he asked. "Are we ready?" Grace nodded. Trick shrugged his rucksack from his back. "Light," he called, as he began to unzip the various compartments. A shaky torch beam appeared, cutting through the darkness between the bridge and the steep bank to their left. "Damn it, Pete!" Trick shouted. "This job is hard enough already. Any chance you could keep the torch still for longer than a second?" "Sorry," Pete called from the shadows. "Faith thought she heard someone." "It's okay, Pete," Grace called back through gritted teeth, her fingers pressing a little more firmly against the brickwork. "You're doing fine. You too, Faith," she added as an afterthought, thinking of the friend she had dragged along to keep watch. Though Pete and Faith were on the bank, concealed by the shadows and hidden among the trees and bushes, she could hear their murmurs as they talked quietly between themselves. The torch beam steadied, and the wall next to Grace was brought to life in an explosion of colour. Slowly turning to face the wall, Grace trailed her fingertips along the paintwork, as though the graffiti might somehow make the bricks feel different. Trick's bag clanked as he reached inside to pull out a can of spray paint. "There," he said, checking the label in the beam of Pete's torch. "Midnight Black." He offered Grace the can. Steadying herself on the ledge, Grace shook the aerosol, pulled the lid off, and with a final glance at the half-lit wall in front of her, began spraying. There was something about having a can of paint in her hand that relaxed her. Suddenly it was all worth it. The fear, the danger, the risk of being caught. She allowed herself to move back from the wall a little, each stroke of paint becoming more confident as she focused only on her work and on the picture that was slowly taking shape in front of her. With a final flourish, she lowered the can and stepped back to get a better look at her work, but her foot dipped into nothingness. Her hands instinctively shot forward to claw at the brick wall, but there was nothing to grasp. In that instant, she knew it was all over. She closed her eyes anticipating the stomach-lurching fall she knew was coming, and then a strong hand took hold of her forearm and pulled her almost effortlessly back onto the ledge. "What the hell was that?" Trick's words came between deep breaths, and with her body pulled close against his, Grace could feel that his heart was beating just as fast as hers. "I slipped." Trick exhaled. "No kidding, and you almost took me with you." He turned to look down over the ledge. "Let's just finish this thing and get the hell out of here." Grace nodded, unable to form any more words as the adrenaline continued to surge through her. With a shaking hand, she raised her can and began spraying again. The lines were a little uneven, but Grace was willing to let it slide if it meant getting off the bridge sooner. Trick turned to Grace and lifted his balaclava. "Done. Now what do you say we get back onto solid ground?" Grace opened her mouth to reply, but before she was able to speak, the torch beam swung away and they were plunged into darkness. And then a piercing scream filled the air. Instinctively, Grace flattened herself against the wall. The aerosol fell from her hand and clunked once beside her feet before falling over the edge. The distance between her and the railway tracks below suddenly seemed to double in height, and she clutched at the brickwork, sure that she wouldn't be so lucky if she slipped a second time. "What happened?" Trick whispered. "Where did Pete go with the torch?" "I don't know, I can't see anything." For a moment, all was quiet. Then came the clanking of paint cans being dropped into a bag and the sharp sound of a zip being pulled closed. Listening intently, Grace frowned at the shuffling sound beside her, realizing that Trick was making his way along the ledge to where the bank rose sharply up to meet the bridge. "Where the hell are you going?" Grace whispered. "I'm getting out of here." There was a dull thud as something heavy landed on the bank beneath Trick. His bag. Grace was just able to make out Trick's silhouette, leaning away from the bridge. He steadied himself, and Grace realized he was about to jump. "Trick, wait!" Without a word, Trick stepped forward and disappeared into the darkness. Grace held her breath, waiting for a sound, a sign that would tell her that he was okay. "Don't just stand there," his voice called up from the shadows. "Go!" Grace continued her way along the ledge, her heart quickening with every step. Then footsteps sounded on the bridge above. Grace froze. It could be anyone, nothing to do with them. But the way the footsteps were moving, slowly, from one side of the bridge to the other, told Grace that this person was looking for someone. And there was only one person left to find on this bridge. Barely even daring to breathe, she squeezed her eyes closed, her head pounding in time with her heart. The footsteps drew nearer, growing louder until they came to a halt somewhere overhead. For a moment there was silence, and Grace imagined a figure leaning over the wall above her, peering down to where she stood holding her breath. She flattened herself against the bricks, pushing herself as far into the shadows as possible. A strange sound came from above, a sharp scraping that was followed by a burst of orange light. Then, only a metre or so to her right, a lit match fell from the bridge, the flame tumbling quickly into the darkness before disappearing. It was quickly followed by another match, this one falling in a wider arc, as though the person above had flicked it with some force. What were they doing? Using the light from the matches to search the ledge? Why not just bring a torch? Grace tried to flatten herself further against the wall, ignoring the way the rough bricks scraped her cheek through her balaclava. It felt like hours, but it must have only been seconds before the footsteps started again, this time continuing across to the other side. Now was her chance. Grace started to move, shuffling her feet along the ledge with as much speed as she dared until she reached the bank. As quietly as she could, she stepped from the ledge onto the verge, slowly backing away as she watched the figure moving along the bridge. He wore a hooded top, his face concealed. He stood for a moment, leaning over the wall to look down before striking another match and tossing it into the blackness. Then he crossed back to Grace's side of the bridge. Again he peered down, searching the ledge that Grace had been on only seconds before. It was time to leave. Grace turned, only to see a face inches from her. She tried to scream, but a hand reached out to cover her mouth, the other taking her by the arm and pulling her towards the trees. She pulled away, but the grip grew tighter as the other person spoke. "It's me," Pete whispered, slowly removing his hand from her face. With both hands, Grace gripped at Pete's jacket. "You scared me." "Sorry, but you were about to scream." Grace glanced over her shoulder at the stranger on the bridge. "What now?" "Now we leave." Securing her hand in his, Grace let Pete guide her along the bank. "This way," he whispered, squeezing her hand tightly. He pulled her deep into the thicket of trees until the air around them was clogged with the scent of earth and fallen leaves. The bank was steep, the ground thick with tree roots, and on more than one occasion Grace stumbled, her trainers slipping in the dirt. But Pete was strong, and his hand simply tightened around hers, lifting her back to her feet. Finally they stopped, and there was no sound other than their breathing. Grace pulled off her balaclava, relishing the cool air against her face. "You think he's still there?" she whispered. "And what was he doing with those matches?" "I don't know." "Where did Faith go? What happened?" "She kept telling me she could hear something, that she thought she could see someone moving behind the trees. I went to take a look, and the next thing I know, she screams and runs off back to school." "You think it was the person on the bridge?" "Who knows? I didn't see anyone until I made my way down from the bank." Grace shivered. "I hope she's okay." "I'm sure she's fine," Pete said. He placed an arm around Grace's shoulder and rubbed her arm. She leaned into him, grateful for the warmth. "We should probably wait here a while, though, just to make sure." Grace looked up at Pete, at the way his blonde hair caught the moonlight. "Thanks," she said. "For what?" "For not leaving me." Pete shrugged and pulled her closer. "Hey, it's what I'm here for, right?" "I mean it, Pete. You're a great friend." He looked down at her, and just for a second, Grace thought she saw the lines of a frown etched across his forehead. "Thanks, you too." They stood together in silence, waiting and listening until Grace could no longer stand the cold. "He must have gone by now," she said, her teeth chattering. "Shall we head back?" "Sure," said Pete, "if that's what you want." They made their way back along the bank, grabbing onto tree trunks for support. When they emerged from the thicket of trees, the bridge was empty. "Looks like we're in the clear," Pete said. Grace tried to rub some warmth into her hands. "Can we just get back to school now? I want to check on Faith." "Don't you want to see?" Pete flicked on his torch and shone it against the bridge, lighting Grace's artwork. Grace stared. "I didn't get the detailing on the tail quite right." Pete laughed softly, and even in the darkness, Grace could tell he was shaking his head at her. Always the perfectionist. "How will I ever get better if I can't criticize my own work?" "You've done 96 of these things. 96! How can you still be questioning whether you've got the damn thing right?" "Because I've got 4 more to do. The last one has to be perfect." "It's a graffiti tag, Grace. Hardly comparable to your final art project." "Actually, it's more important." Grace took the torch from Pete, chewing her lip as she took in the work she and Trick had created. A dragon chasing its own tail. "You sure it actually looks like the letter Q?" "Yes, I'm sure. Would I ever lie to you?" He reached out to brush a strand of hair from her face, and this time he was definitely frowning. He opened his mouth to say something, but before he could, a twig snapped loudly behind them. Pete turned, shining the torch beam into the darkness. Then came another crack, and another. Someone was moving quickly between the trees. The beam swung wildly from side to side as Pete searched the shadows. Then the light picked out a hooded figure, disappearing behind a tree only meters from where they stood. For a moment, nobody moved. Grace could just about see the outline of the figure behind the tree, his head turning from side to side as he looked for an escape route, but the only way out was to get to the road, and that meant going through Grace and Pete. The figure darted towards them, almost colliding with Grace. Pete grabbed at the stranger's arm, and they struggled together, their feet slipping in the mud. "Pete, let him go!" Grace cried, but it was too late. With a final shove, the stranger pulled himself free and sent Pete flying backwards, disappearing into the darkness as he tumbled down the bank, his fall punctuated by the sickening sound of branches cracking beneath his weight. Grace covered her mouth and turned to look at the silhouette standing before her, his shoulders rising and falling in time with his breathing. He stared at her for a few seconds, the glint of his eyes the only thing visible beneath his hood. Then he turned and ran into the shadows, leaving Grace standing alone on the steep verge.